Hello, I'm Regan, and before this video starts, I'm just letting you know that there may be swearing and that any threats that may occur are in-game threats. All of this was streamed live on my Twitch, so if you enjoyed, please subscribe for more. Anyways, enjoy the video.
Hey stream, how are you guys doing? I'm really not in the mood to fake my energy, because really that's what I've been trying to do for the past few streams, is fake my energy. I don't even know if my just chatting screen is going to work because of it glitching out, but let's have a look-see. It'll just be like one thing missing, so that's not too bad. But I was thinking that we could just chill and we could like read some ghost stories. And it sounds, I don't know, it's one of those things where I've had ghost story books in my life for years and years and years. Yeah, so there's like one thing missing, which is not bad. Let's see if, I don't even know if I can get my view back up. Yeah, no, it's just like all errors, it just says errors. Actually could probably fix this real quick, hold on. It'll just be but a second. I will disconnect for that second, but it'll be just a quick one. Just real quick disconnect second. I promise I'll be right back. There we go. Now you can see my little bouncy boy. Isn't he a marvelous little bouncy boy? Hi, Lily. He's such a great little bouncy boy. I got two different books of ghost stories here with me. I have The World's Best True Ghost Stories and More Ghost Stories. World's Best True Ghost Stories, I can't tell you how long I've had this. It was my first ghost story book. I got it so long ago. Let's see if I can find the publishing year in this. Oh dear. Well, some of the stories in here are copyright go back to 1959. There's 1950 or 1973 in here. You're ready to be scared. I'm gonna read from The World's Best True Ghost Stories first. It's been so long since I've read these. Okay. Pick a number between 1 and 10. Because there's 10 different sections of the stories. And we'll read one of those. 7. So 7's ghost stories are saved by the ghost. That's what that category is. 83, there we go. Saved by a ghost. Some ghosts are not much fun, but they are even better, protective spirits who warn the living of danger. They sometimes even actively save lives. Here are a few intriguing tales of their extraordinary helpfulness. If you guys would prefer to have a more scared one, I can do that. We can change it. I'm going to change my currently reading, though, to Saved by a Ghost. Saved by a Ghost. There we go. Saved. Alright. So, the first one is Lord Dufferin's story. Lord Dufferin, a British diplomat, was the central figure of this story, which has become one of England's classic tales of the supernatural. One night, during a stay at a friend's county house in Ireland, Lord Dufferin was unusually restless and could not sleep. He had an inexplicable feeling of dread, and so to calm his nerves, he arose and walked across the room to the window. A full moon illuminated the bright garden below, so that it was almost as bright as the morning. Suddenly, Lord Dufferin was conscious of a movement in the shadows, and a man appeared, carrying a long box on his back. The silent and sinister figure walked slowly across the moonlit yard. As he passed the window from which Lord Dufferin intently watched, he stopped and looked directly into the diplomat's eyes. Lord Dufferin recoiled, for the face of the man carrying the burden was so ugly that he could not even describe it later. For a moment their eyes met, and the man moved off into the shadows. The box on his back was clearly seen to be a casket. The next morning Lord Dufferin asked his host and the other guests about the man in the garden, but no one knew anything about him. They even accused him of having had a nightmare, but he knew better. Many years later in Paris, when Lord Dufferin was serving as an English ambassador to France, he was about to walk into an elevator on his way to a meeting. For some inexplicable reason, he glanced at the elevator operator. With a violent start, he recognized the man he had seen carrying the coffin across the moonlit garden. Involuntarily, he stepped back from the elevator and stood there as the door closed and it started up without him. His agitation was so great that he remained... I've seen a ghost. I guess they're not quite ghosts. I like to think of them more as like visions of the past almost. Because it's not like I've seen the full body, but I've seen like the glancing of a hand or things, or the future anyways. His agitation... Okay, it's not that exciting. It's not that great. But I do have haunted objects in my house. I have two here with me in my room. One is this Pocahontas bear that I have, and the other is a doll I've had since I was very young called Rose. I have both of those. And then my ghost kind of story is I was walking out of my room, and there's a stairwell down from my room with like bars to keep you from falling into the stairwell. And I saw a hand grab for me through one of those bars. I've also seen a spirit come out of where we have our laundry room and things. It was very interesting. Most of the time they just leave us alone. I also have a haunted painting at things, so yeah, okay, you probably can't, but I am in the VC and my Discord if you wanted to join and talk about it, but yeah. So back to the story. His agitation was so great that he remained motionless for several minutes. Then a terrific crash startled him. The cable had parted, and the elevator had fallen 3 floors to the basement. Several passengers were killed in the tragedy, and the operator himself died. Investigation revealed the operator had been hired for just that day. No one ever found out who he was or where he came from. Yeah, I didn't think he could. Okay, the next one is the Phantom Stagecoach. Stagecoach. Many years ago, there was a small Arizona frontier town that was kept alive by a nearby gold mine. Oh, I love this one. I just remembered what one this is. The town had once been on the stagecoach route, but when the mine petered out and was abandoned, the stage line was discontinued. Now the little town was almost completely cut off from the rest of the settlements. Only a tiny freight line run infrequently by a local livery I don't know which way it is. Livery stable owner remained. One young boy in the poverty-stricken town was always exploring the nearby hills, hoping to find another mine to bring back the people who had moved away, and also the stagecoach, which he had loved. He had always been there to meet the stagecoach when it came tearing into the little town in a cloud of dust. The other people in town looked upon the boy's prospecting with amusement, but they did not bother him. In fact, they hoped that he would find a mine and bring back prosperity to the town. One day the boy left for the hills as usual, with his burro and his lunch, but by nightfall he had not returned. As he'd always been back by dark before, his folks became concerned. True, he was self-reliant and used to the rough living of the times in the area, but anything might have happened. Finally, just after midnight, he came home, exhausted but excited. The stagecoach, he said, had come back to town after all. Then he told this story. He had become separated from his burrow back in the hills, and after searching for a long time, he gave up and started home on foot. It was dark by the time he reached the old coach road to town, and he could hear the howls of wolves in the timber of the foothills close by. He hurried, but his cries of the wolves behind him became louder and louder. In panic, he climbed to the top of a high rock by the roadside to wait for the pack to close in. Just as the wolves approached, he heard the noise of a stagecoach coming along the old road. A dark stage, drawn by black horses, pulled around the bend and came to a leather creaking stop beside the rock where he clung in terror. The driver motioned for him to climb in, and then the coach raced towards town with the wolves howling right behind. His parents had trouble believing the boy's story. No one had seen the stagecoach in years, and the boy was known to have an active imagination. But the strangest part was to come to light the next day. Just outside of town, a huge gray wolf, obviously run over by a heavy wagon or stagecoach. The tracks of the vehicle came right to the edge of town, and then they stopped. They did not turn around and go back. They just stopped, as though they had vanished with the coach that made them. Something had brought the boy back to safety, and it was certainly more substantial than imagination. The doctor's visitor. Water. I'm gonna need water after every short story. I'm not made to read things out loud super long. The doctor's visitor. All right. Bye-bye. The doctor's visitor. Dr. S. Weir Mitchell of Philadelphia was one of the nation's foremost neurologists during the latter part of the 19th century. One snowy evening, after a particularly hard day, he retired early and was just falling asleep when his doorbell rang loudly. He hoped it had been a trick of his ears or that his caller would go away, but the bell rang again, even more insistently. Struggling awake, he snatched a robe and stumbled down to see who it was. He muttered in annoyance as he slid the bolt to unlock the door, completely unprepared for the shivering child who stood in the swirling snow. The small, pale girl trembled on the doorstep, for a thin frock and a ragged shawl were her only protection against the blustering, snow-filled wind. She said in a tiny, plaintive voice, "My mother is very sick. Won't you come, please?" Dr. Michel explained that he had retired for the night and suggested that the child call another doctor in the vicinity, but she wouldn't leave and looked up at him with tear-filled eyes, pleading again, "Won't you come, please?" No one, and certainly no doctor, could refuse this pitiful appeal. With a resigned sigh, thinking longingly of his warm bed, the physician asked the child to step inside while he dressed and picked up his bag. Then he followed her out into the storm. In a house several streets away, he found a woman desperately sick with pneumonia. Yes. He recognized her immediately as someone who had once worked for him as a servant, and he bent over the bed, determined to save her. As he worked, the doctor complimented her on her daughter's fortitude and persistence in getting him there. The woman stared unbelievingly at the doctor and said in a weak whisper, "That's impossible. My little girl died more than a month ago. Her dress is still hanging in that cupboard over there." With strange emotions, Dr. Mitchell strode to the cupboard and opened it. Inside hugged the little dress and the tattered shawl that his caller had worn. They were warm and dry and never could have been out in the storm. The Indian Guide. In the pioneer days of the Old West, a family had settled on the edge of a wide forest. Close by in the woods lived an old Indian couple who were very friendly. The old Indians and the little daughter of the pioneer family were particularly fond of each other. One winter, when the youngster was about 6, she started walking through the woods to visit another little girl who lived in a cabin about a mile away. She had gone there alone many times before, so her parents thought nothing of her making the trip again. Even though it was winter and it looked like snow, there were a few wild animals in the forest, and no wolves had been seen in the area for many years. A few hours later, when it started getting dark, her parents became concerned. When her father stepped out into the twilight to look for her, he found to his dismay that it was snowing heavily. There was no sign of his small daughter. At once, he and his oldest boy, bundled up in their heaviest clothes, took a lantern and musket, and started off at a trot down the trail to the other cabin. As they ran along, they kept calling the girl's name, but their only reply was the howling of the wind and an occasional hoot from a great gray owl. At the neighbor's house, they learned that the little girl had left some time ago, before the snow began, and should have arrived home long before. Their alarm mounted, but perhaps they reasoned she had left the trail to visit the hut of the old Indian couple. The girl's brother turned off to visit the Indians, while her father and neighbors headed homewards, fanning out through the dark woods to see if they might find the girl before the snow and storm covered up all tracks. The men reached home first, and were overjoyed to find the little girl safe by the fire, drinking hot broth while her mother dried her clothes. She had lost her way, she told them. After stumbling on the dress for a while, she had started to cry. Almost at once, her old Indian friend had appeared and led her home, holding her tiny hand in his all the way, until they could see the lights of her cabin ahead. Then he had smiled at her and vanished into the dark woods behind them. Her brother returned from the Indian's hut with a sad tale. There he said he had found the old squaw huddled by the body of her husband, who had died 2 days before. Protection from beyond. In America's Old West, tomahawks were often the instrument of death for many courageous pioneers. At least once, however, this weapon played an exciting and mysterious part in saving a child from a tragic end. A hardy settler and his family lived in a cabin far out in the wilderness. Wolves frequently raided the flocks and were even said to attack people when hunger made them ravenous. To add to the dangers, Indians still roamed the area, looking for whatever they could steal. Occasionally they attacked a cabin, burned it, and killed the inhabitants. One day, the 7-year-old daughter of the family came upon a very old and sick Indian in the woods. Instead of running away in panic, she helped the ancient man to the cabin, pleaded with her folks to care for him. In spite of their misgivings, her parents agreed. It soon became clear that he did not have long to live. Although the old man could speak no English, he and the little girl became fast friends. She did everything she could to make his last days comfortable, and he was obviously very grateful. Just before he died, he called the girl and her parents to his bedside. Giving his tomahawk to the child, he motioned to the father to hang it on the wall over her small bunk. His wish was granted, although the family could not understand why he insisted on it. Some weeks later, while the father and mother were away, the little girl was napping in her bunk. A gaunt wolf slipped out of the forest and headed for the cabin. He slunk up to the door, sniffed a few times, and then pushed against it. It swung open. He entered the house, his yellow eyes focused on the tiny girl asleep in the bunk before him. When the parents returned, they were horrified to see a huge wolf apparently crawling into their cabin. They raced across the clearing, shouting, but the wolf did not move. He was dead, his skull crushed from a terrible blow on the head. Their daughter was still asleep in her bunk. Later, the father jokingly said that perhaps the old Indian had come back to protect the little girl with his tomahawk. Something impelled him to lift the crude weapon from its peg over the bunk. As he looked at it, his laughter ceased. The blade was splotched with dried blood, and in the rawhide thong that bound the primitive blade to the stout handle were several long gray hairs, such as might be found on the head of a timber wolf. That's all the stories in section 7. Saved by a ghost. Let's see. Siri. Hey Siri. Pick a number between 1 and 10.
A random number between 1 and 10 is...
Well, it went just to 8, so you know what? I guess we're just reading the next section. The next section is labeled Bizarre. So, let me do that. Bizarre. It has it all in caps, so I'm trying to do it all in caps, but I only have one hand. There we go. Bizarre. Okay. Ah!
Oops, I lost a book. Anyways, so the section titled Bizarre is said, almost everyone has experienced some peculiar feeling or event, or heard a fantastic tale from a thoroughly reliable source. When it comes to you or to someone you trust, the occurrence is hard to ignore, even when it appears bizarre. The Ghost with the Flaming Fingers. Every small town along the Hudson Valley in New York State has a pet ghost. Take, for instance, the famous ghost that have been seen near Leeds, a few miles northwest of Catskill. She was a novel ghost for several reasons. In the late 1700s, an unpleasant character named Ralph Sutherland came to this country from Scotland, bringing a servant girl with him. He abused the young woman to the point where she could not stand it. At last, she ran away. Good on her. Sutherland's anger knew no bounds. He mounted his horse and overtook her as she fled down a country road. Then he tied her hands together and, leaping upon his horse, dragged her back to the house. Some say they tied her to the horse's tail. In any case, she was dead when they arrived home. Sutherland was arrested and tried. He claimed that he had not meant to harm the girl, but only to teach her a lesson. The horse had become frightened and had run away, he said, throwing him and dragging her to her death. That's upsetting, and also probably a lie. Sutherland's sentence to death was suspended until he should reach 99 years of age, if he lived that long. In the meantime, he was to wear a hangman's noose about his neck and report to the judges at Catskill once a year. This, it is reported, he did, but in the meantime, the ghost of the young girl began to haunt the area. She was seen sitting on the stone wall of the Sutherland garden, with flames rising from each fingertip as she laughed long and loudly at the fear she aroused in the vicinity. At other times she was said to have been seen tied to a black horse's tail, as they dragged her shrieking past Sutherland's house night after night. But here the legend becomes confused. As an almost identical account of the Ghost of Leeds, has the villain's name as Bill Salisbury, and the girl as a Native American sent to him as a servant by parents who couldn't control her. Furthermore, Salisbury was supposed to be hanged at 90 instead of 99. Instead of a noose, he had to wear a red string around his neck. The legend has that the girl sitting on the rock, Spook Rock, it's called. That's a clever name. Very clever. With a lighted candle on each fingertip instead of flames, and a shaggy white dog howling, heartbroken, at her feet. I like this one. It's interesting. If I had read it before, I would have put a trigger warning there. I apologize for that. The Old Man of the Woods. Presque Isle, Maine, one of the most remote spots in the United States. It's perhaps for the reason the setting for many particular legends and tales. A resident of Presque Isle reported the following weird incident to me during World War II. Near where this man's father had lived as a boy, there was a Presque Isle family with 2 children, a boy and a girl. The youngsters had no friends to play with in the deserted area, and so had to invent their own games and entertainment. They often took walks in the nearby woods. One day, they began to talk about a nice old man who lived in a cabin back over the hills. At first, the parents were concerned, but no one knew of any such man, nor could his cabin be found. They decided he had been dreamed up by the children to make up for their lack of real friends, so they didn't give the matter any thought. As time went on, the children began to report some things the old man said would happen to the local residents, their livestock and crops. Strangely enough, almost all these dire events took place. People lost their crops. There we go. Their livestock died, and folks were taken sick just as the children's newfound friend had said they would. The parents of the youngsters didn't approve of the morbid interest in death and destruction that the children were displaying. The children were refused permission to visit the woods any more, but they still sneaked away whenever they could. Finally, the parents delivered an ultimatum. Either the children would bring the old man home to meet them, or they would be forbidden ever to see him again. The boy and girl said they would invite him, but they were not sure he would come. Off they went into the woods. parents laughingly waited, assuming there were no such person at all, but marveling at how the children could have gone off so full of confidence, they soon found out. Half-hour later, the two children returned. A tall, bearded man, obviously very old, but with a strong, active stride, was with them. He was dressed strangely in a suit of black material that had twinkling glints of gold here and there. His battered hat, while old, appeared to be made of some special black fur felt. His beard was pure white, and his blue eyes were piercing. He greeted the parents pleasantly, and soon they were reassured that their children had indeed found an interesting and unusual friend. After staying a while, the old man bade them farewell, and asked if the children could walk back with him to the edge of the woods to say goodbye. The parents agreed, and off the three started, the man holding the youngsters by their hands. As they walked towards the sunset, the parents were startled to see that only the children cast any shadows. There was none for the bearded man between them. Neither the man nor the children were ever seen again. The Ghost of Deadman's Curve. In 1908, a local trolley line ran from Port Chester to Rye Village and Rye Beach in New York State. The tracks crossed a road that was simply a right-of-way raised up over a swamp. A hand-operated switch at the crossing point could throw the trolley on either two routes. The swampland was full of tall reeds, cattails, pools of dark, evil-smelling water, and reputedly quicksand. A highly unlikely place for human beings to venture. But apparently, one unfortunate person did. Or did he? One late night, the trolley rocked and clattered down the tracks to the crossing point. The motorman stopped and got down to throw the switch so that he could proceed towards Rye. There were two passengers in the huge, dimly lit car, one seated at each end. Neither man paid any particular attention to the other. After the motorman had climbed down to the switch, one of the men also got up and left the car. The switch was thrown. The motorman came back to his post. The car started along, picking up speed. For some time, the remaining passenger did not realize that the other man had not returned. When he did, and told the motorman, they were almost in Rye. The motorman quickly reported the lost traveler. The search party was quickly organized, for the swamp was known to be treacherous, but neither that search party nor one formed the next day could find any trace of the missing man. Where could he have gone? The most logical explanation was that the man, probably a stranger, had set off across the swamps and had perished in one of the bottomless pools or in quicksand. Nothing certainly was ever seen or heard of him again. From then on, until the trolley line was discontinued, that crossing point in the swamp was known as Deadman's Curve, and people gave it a wide berth on dark nights or gloomy days. Those who did occasionally walk along the tracks often reported of low moans or faint calls for help, with whistling and splashing from deep in the marshland. Perhaps they were the natural voices of the swamp, the calls of birds or the moaning of the wind in the bulrushes, or perhaps they were the regretful cries at the shade of an ill-fated traveler who stepped out of a trolley and into eternity. I love how these leave off. I really do. I just find it so fun. The Haunted Schoolhouse. The small schoolhouse in Newburyport, Massachusetts, was the scene of a strange phenomenon in 1870. Every day, a mysterious yellow glow spread over the classroom windows and blackboards. Usually started near the hall door and spread silently over the room. After about 2 minutes, it faded away. It did no harm while it cast its light over the room, but afterwards the students and the teacher, Miss Lucy A. Perkins, felt weak and ill. The yellow radiance was not the only unusual occurrence. There was also a gust of cold air that swept through the room, even when the doors and windows were tightly closed. The chill breeze rustled the papers, swung the faded map on the wall, and shook the hanging lamp. This, too, made the teacher and children feel slightly ill, but Miss Perkins kept the class going day after day, trying bravely to ignore the strange event. The late fall, the yellow light disappeared, and a low-pitched laugh was heard. The eerie sound echoed in the tiny attic, small coal cellar, and the hall. One day, many of the students at Miss Perkins saw a child's hand floating in the air. Then the arm became visible. The climax came on November 1st. During a geography lesson, Miss Perkins called upon a student to recite. In the midst of a sentence, he suddenly stopped and pointed to the hall. There stood a boy with his arm upraised, with the same arm and hand that had floated in the air. The boy stood silently, his face bound in a white cloth as though he had an injured jaw or a toothache. Then as they watched, he slowly vanished. From that time on, the schoolhouse was plagued no more. The authorities questioned 3 local boys, who had a reputation for mischief, in an attempt to solve the mystery. They decided they had no part in the events. To this day, the yellow glow, the cold breeze, and the boy with the upraised arm and bandaged jaw have never been explained. And that's Area 8. Bizarre. I just remembered something that I have that could be more fun than asking Siri to give me a number. Because I was a D&D player. I still kind of am. I need a new group. So if I take a D10, this is percentile, but it's fine. I haven't even got to use these dice. I bought dice after I didn't have a group, and I still haven't got to use them. But we can roll a D10 to figure out what the next story is going to be. Let's see. Area 6. 786. It's quite interesting. 6. Ghost in the house. Seems interesting. Ghost in the house. There we go. Update that. Drink some water. And let's go back, shall we? Why is the house haunted? Why does the ghost need to remain in it, endlessly repeating the same actions? Hauntings in this chapter are of vastly different types, but every one of them reveals the obsession of a troubled spirit. What should be done with a ghost in the house? The Ghost of Greylock. I can vouch for this ghost sighting personally. It happened to me. I once hunted fairly regularly in Massachusetts with a friend named Dick Davis. On one trip, Davis and I decided to work our way up the slopes of Mount Greylock, in the northwestern corner of the state, between Adams and North Adams. Mount Greylock isn't huge, 3,506 feet, but it is rugged, and there were plenty of white-tailed deer browsing on its slopes. We slept the first night in a haymow, and went off separately the next morning. We planned to meet late in the afternoon at a deserted farmhouse we saw up on the slope. About mid-afternoon, I was hunting along the edge of a swamp when I was startled to hear the shrill blast of a police whistle through the bush. I know I hadn't passed any red lights, so I waited to see what was coming. It turned out to be an old fellow who lived in the area. He was hunting rabbits with an eager beagle. The whistle was to call the pup. We got to talking, and I mentioned meeting Davis at the old farmhouse later. The hunter looked at me sharply. "Wouldn't go in there, son," he said. "Better meet your friend out front." When I asked him why I shouldn't go into the old house, he mumbled something about bad flooring, then picked up his shotgun and left with the pup at his heels. When I got to the farmhouse later, however, I did go in, decided to wait in one of the upstairs rooms. It overlooked an orchard where a few apples might still attract a deer. I settled down to wait. The floors and stairs seemed firm enough to me, as the old building was run down, long deserted, and had a corner of its roof missing. About a half hour after I arrived, I heard Dick climb the porch steps, knock snow off his boots. Fudge. I lost my place. There we go. Right? Yeah. Knock snow and mud from his boots, and to come in. I decided to keep still and give him a bit of a scare should he start up the stairs. I heard him walking around down below, opening and shutting the old cupboard doors. Then he came to the foot of stairs, just below the room in which I was squatting by the window. He started up, and I expected to see his red knitted cap appear over the top step any second. It didn't appear. Perhaps he had seen my muddy tracks and had decided to surprise me, I thought. He was waiting on the stairs. Okay, I'd outwit him. A half hour later, I was still crouching by the window, waiting. I hadn't heard another sound from the person than this was, and by now I was in a rather nervous state, even if I did have a loaded shotgun in my hands. Suddenly, a movement in the orchard below caught my eye. It was Dick! Gun ready, I rose and crept out of the room. The stairs were deserted. I rushed out of the house to meet Dick and never went back in. I've often wondered who or what had started up those old stairs to... God, you scared me! Good night! I rushed out of the house to meet Dick and never went back in. I've often wondered who or what had started up those old stairs to where I waited, and then changed his mind. For as I hurried out of the house, I noted there were no other tracks but mine on the faded yellow floor. I did not need to be scared by my dad. Nope. There's what I wanted. Okay. Alright. The Octagon hauntings. Who is the ghost that resides in the famous Octagon house in Washington, D.C.? Is it the shade of a young suicide, or is the wife of a great president? The 8-sided brick mansion, built in 1798, stands on the corner of New York Avenue and 18th Street, now the national headquarters of the American Institute of Architects. Designed by Dr. William Thornton, who had also designed the Capitol. Originally, it was built for Colonel is spelled so weird. Colonel John Taylor of Mount Airy, Virginia. Later, President James Madison and his wife Dolly lived there. Why does that... It made it hard to read because they split the Dolly in half. Dolly lived there. The entrance hall of the Octagon is circular, with curved doors and windows to fit the round walls. Running up to the top of the 3-story building from the center of the next hall is a spiral staircase, plays an important part in the story of the Octagon ghost. The circular entrance foyer extends up through the house, providing a round room on each floor, including the basement. Just outside the basement wall, there's a brick-lined and arched roof tunnel, which comes to a dead end after 20 feet. It is assumed that this tunnel once led to a small creek or bayou along the Potomac River, but no one really knows. For example, according to ghost legend, as we shall see, this tunnel may have once led directly to the White House, a few blocks away. Though through it, Dolly Madison is said to have carried valuables, including the famous unfinished Gilbert Stuart painting of George Washington, to keep them safe when the British set fire to the White House in 1814. According to the first ghost legend, one of Colonel Taylor's $15 ran off and was married against his wishes. She returned to ask his forgiveness, wearing lilacs in her hair. He said he never wanted to see her again. Without a word, she climbed to the top of the great stairwell and with a scream plunged to the lower hall in death. It's said that to this day, on rare occasions, one can still hear that scream, the crash of her body to the first floor. On other days, Octagon visitors smell lilacs. Another sign that the suicide ghost is close by. Competing for status with Miss Taylor's shade, of course, is that of Dolly Madison, who, when lilacs are sniffed and screams or crashes are heard, is said to be running through the basement tunnel in panic, in her haste, occasionally dropping Washington's portrait with a resounding crash. The Waterford's Ghost's Revenge. It's not often that a ghost has a chance to get revenge on people who are still alive. But near Waterford, New York, supposedly one did just that. It took place around 1900. At the time, near the end of a barge canal, there lived a carpenter. He was poor and sick with tuberculosis, but he still worked hard to support his wife and 2 children with earnings from odd jobs about the village. For Fortunately, his own parents were particularly selfish, cruel, and mercenary. Is that mercenary? No, it can't. Hold on. Now I have to look this up. It can't be. Is it mercenary? Okay, I need my sound up so I can hear, please. And thank you.
Mercenary.
It is mercenary.
Mercenary.
Interesting. Not what I would expect. They demanded that he will they demanded that he will them his house and property, which in case of his death would have gone to his wife. This, of course, the carpenter refused to do. Shortly before he died, however, he warned his parents that if they did anything to harm his family after he was gone, he would come back and haunt them as long as they lived. He would see to it, he said, that they would never make any profit from his house, even if they did get it away from his wife. As soon as their son had passed away, the parents undertook legal proceedings and managed to attain possession of the property, evicting the impoverished wife and youngsters. The house was run down, but usable, and they hoped to rent it rather quickly, so they closed the blinds and waited for a tenant. But no tenant ever rented it, for presently strange things began to happen. Some of the neighbors, passing the empty house late at night, noticed lights shining between the shuttered windows and from between loose boards along the side. At first they thought that perhaps the wife had come back and was living there secretly. They'd liked the wife, so they did not investigate too carefully. However, the lights started to wave about and flicker from within, far too mysteriously for comfort. People began to cross the road when they passed that way. After dark, rumors spread that the son was making good on his promise to keep the parents from making any money from the cottage, so no one wanted to rent the place. It fell more and more into despair. Even in its last years, when it was completely uninhabitable, the mysterious lights could be seen still. The greedy parents, nevertheless, kept trying to rent or sell the place. No one would listen to them. The lights continued showing right up until the day when, with a muffled crash and a cloud of dry dust, a sagging roof fell in, and the tottering walls collapsed into the cellar hole. Only then did the lights vanish, never to return. No one could explain the mysterious lights, but many neighbors felt sure that the Waterford ghost had its revenge. The Baby Ghost. Tales about baby ghosts are few to begin with, and seldom are they as tragic as this one from upstate New York. Near the town of Sodus, which is just south of Lake Ontario and about halfway between Rochester and Oswego, there lived a widow and her 1-year-old daughter. The recent death of her husband had left the woman somewhat demented. She was extremely nervous and afraid of thunderstorms and lightning. One night, a terrific storm came up from over the lake. The thunder and lightning banged and crashed about her small house for hours. As the storm's fury increased, the poor woman became increasingly panicky. Her baby, in its small crib by the fireplace, cried louder and louder. Finally, the widow's nerves cracked completely, and she went mad. No one knows just what happened, but after the storm was over, a neighbor who dropped by to see if she was all right found the woman groveling on the floor of the little house. The baby was dead in its crib. The neighbors, after examining the small body, decided that the poor woman, in a moment of insane rage, had killed the child to stop its crying. The mother died a short time afterwards, but for weeks, whenever a thunderstorm came up, folks who passed the house claimed they could hear a baby crying inside, although they knew no one was there. Some months later lightning struck the house and burned it flat. Only a ruin was left. Still during thunderstorms, people continued to hear the baby crying above the wind and rain. Finally, unnerved neighbors banded together to try to stop the cries by completely demolishing the chimney and fireplace. The Stones of the chimney were spread about the countryside, and all signs of the house were either filled in, covered up, or removed entirely from the sight. Then, and only then, were the plaintive cries of the small child stilled, so that folks could walk past the place where the house had been without hearing them. They say, however, that even today, their skies are black with an oncoming thunderstorm, and lightning crackles across the hills far away. You may still hear a soft and low whimper from the clearing where the house once stood. For the next story, I do have to go to the bathroom, so we'll be right back. Just real quick. Alright, I'm back. We'll go ahead and read the next one. It's titled The Headless Lady. A. Charles Needham, recovering from an illness, rented a small cottage on the east of the charming town of Canewdon in south-east Essex, England. The year was 1895, and Needham was resting down to convalesce. Convalesce? This is another one where I'm like, how do I say this? This one.
Convalesce. Convalesce.
Was settling down to convalesce. The housekeeper/cook he hired for day work seemed concerned that he was planning to sleep in the cottage alone. He kept asking if he would be all right. He assured her that as far as he knew, he would be, and that for 2 or 3 nights, he was. Then something happened. He was sitting and reading in the kitchen one midnight when he was startled by a click of the door latch behind him. The door led to the back garden. He watched the latch lift and then slowly fall again. His door was securely bolted at top and bottom. Whoever was outside did not try to push against it. Needham remembered that the front door was unbolted and hurried into the other room. As he slid the bolt home, the latch of the door began to rise to the top of the slot, hesitated a moment, and then slowly dropped into place again. Needham was sick with tuberculosis and not a fit match for an intruder. Nevertheless, he slid back the bolt and threw open the door. There was no one there. For several nights this continued, much to Needham's discomfort, but he decided not to mention the matter either to his housekeeper or to any of the townspeople. He was a lure from London. He suspected that youngsters in the neighborhood might be having a little cruel fun with him. He could withstand their pranks, he decided. But a few weeks later, he had to change his mind. He had been visiting a friend in town, a trust-playing doctor, and his host had offered to drive him back to the college in his pony cart. They were jogging up to the entrance of the little lane leading to the college when suddenly the pony stopped and refused to go further. In spite of blows from the whip, Needham explained it was only a short walk anyway, and got out, thanking his friend for the lift. As he hurried home, he saw a small light ahead of him, along one side of the moonlit road. The trees were thick in that section. Needham assumed the light was a lantern held by another pedestrian on the way home, so he quickened his step to catch up. A few yards further on, the figure had stepped out into the moonlight. Close by his cottage stood a few moments, and then turned towards him. Needham turned and fled in terror. The figure was a woman, but a woman without a head! Ah! Needham ran all the way to the Checkers, a small inn down the road. He gave a babbled description of what he had seen, and he was amazed to learn that the Headless Lady was a well-known Canuden resident who had been murdered and decapitated by her husband many years before. She had once lived in the cottage she had rented, but she had been trying to enter instead of housekeeping again when she found the doors bolted against her. Needham slept at the inn that night. The next day, he moved. The Black Thing in the Cellar. This ghost tale from New Jersey may illustrate the moral that if you happen to have a ghost in your house, the most practical course of action is to be hospitable. May even pay off in hard cash. I just feel like it's good to be hospitable anyways. I mean, technically, they're there first. It seems that a house in Trenton had been known to be haunted for many years, and nobody would rent it, in spite of it being an attractive little cottage in a nice neighborhood. Finally, a local man with a rather bad reputation appeared and offered to take it over. The owner informed him of the house's reputation and detailed its history. The man was not at all fazed. He laughed and signed the lease, saying he wasn't afraid of man, monster, or ghost. One night, after living in the house about a week, the tenant had to go into the cellar. He took a candle and headed down. He was 2 steps above its stone floor when a huge black thing rose up at the bottom of the stairs. It had 2 glowing white-yellow eyes that seemed to stare clear through him. The man was startled, but instead of fleeing, he swore at the phantom and hurled his candlestick at it. The neighbors found him a day or so later. He was alive, but all his hair was burned off, and he was massive bruises from head to toe. He moved out as soon as he was able to. The next tenant was a gentle, elderly lady who did a great deal of work for the local church. She had heard about the phantom, but the little house was inexpensive, and it suited her, and she decided to move in. Ghost or no ghost, she would take her chances. She did. It was lucky for her that she did. For several days in the house, with no disturbance, she too had to go to the cellar after dark. With the gleam of the candle lighted up the stone cellar, the black thing rose up before her. She held the candle higher and said very calmly, "My, you startled me, my friend. But what in the name of heaven do you want? Is there anything I can do to help you, as long as we're going to live here together?" To her astonishment, the black shape motioned for the lady to follow. Slowly drifted back across the stone flogging of the floor to an old wooden chest in the corner. She followed with the candle and obeyed the directions of the thing when it motioned for her to move the chest aside. It was empty and she moved it easily. She found a loose flagstone underneath. The murky figure motioned for her to lift up the flagstone, and again she complied. Underneath it was a lead-lined box full of old gold coins. She stared at them for a moment, then half to herself she said, "Can these be for me?" Turned to look at the phantom. It was gone, but a cool breeze touched her cheek, and almost a friendly caress. Honestly, I think that's probably going to be it. It's just a short little thing, little stream. We're almost at an hour anyways. But thank you guys all so much, really, for watching. I'll just go ahead and see y'all later. Bye-bye!